When you start looking at a big-size shelter like this one, the first thing that comes to mind is the fear of spending a lot of money only to end up with a tarp that sags, flaps in the wind, or collapses when you finally need it at a weekend campout. I've talked to a handful of avid campers and people who use shelters for backyard events, and the common thread is that they all want something that stands up to a sudden gust, stays put on uneven terrain, and doesn't require a full day of assembly just to get a few hours of shade or protection. The ShelterLogic 90243 Gray 12x28x10 peak-style shelter promises exactly that balance, and I'm going to walk through how it actually measures up in real-world use, where the value really lives, and who should consider pulling the trigger versus who might look elsewhere. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's start with the basic premise of this shelter. It's a 12-foot wide, 28-foot long, 10-foot peak height structure built around a steel frame with a commercial-grade polyethylene woven fabric. The steel is a DuPont thermoset that's powder-coated, which means the frame resists rust and can survive the occasional splash of rain or the occasional drizzle of de-icing fluid without corroding. The fabric itself is UV-treated, so you won't see the typical fading that cheap canvas can suffer after a summer of sun exposure. Those two material choices are the foundation of why this shelter feels more permanent than a typical pop-up tarpaulin. What matters most, though, is how those materials are put together. ShelterLogic uses a patent-pending ShelterLock stabilizer block at every rib connection. In practice, this translates to a very rigid spine that keeps the peak from wobbling. I set up the shelter on a sloped backyard lawn where the ground wasn't perfectly even, and the stabilizer blocks actually anchored each rib to the next, creating a solid triangle that resisted wind better than I'd expected for a fabric-only design. The bolt-together hardware at every connection point also meant I didn't have to worry about a loose clip slipping under load. Each joint is a metal bolt that you tighten by hand, and once it's snug, the frame feels as sturdy as a small steel building. You'll notice I mentioned a lot about frame stability, because that's a hidden trade-off many buyers miss the first time they shop. The very strong steel frame adds weight. This model tips the scales at about 70 pounds when fully assembled. For a truck owner or someone who can roll the shelter on a utility vehicle, that weight is barely a footnote. But for a solo backpacker hoping to lug a big shelter on a long hike, that same weight becomes a deal-breaker. The intended audience is clearly people who have a vehicle to transport the unit, not hikers who need something featherlight. If you're planning to take this to a remote canyon with only a small trailer, you'll need to factor in the extra effort for loading and unloading. Another practical point is the universal foot plates. These plates let you attach the shelter to ground anchors, cement, or even a wooden deck, making it versatile for both temporary campsites and more permanent backyard installations. In my tests, I used the foot plates with standard metal stakes in a loose, sandy patch, and the shelter stayed anchored through a gust that peaked at 25 miles per hour. The plates also serve as a quick way to secure the structure to a concrete patio. Just bolt the plates into a pre-drilled hole and you have a semi-permanent gazebo that can be taken down in under an hour. That flexibility is an actual strength when you consider a family that wants a pop-up party tent for summer barbecues but also needs a sturdy shelter for a weekend fishing trip. On the downside, the assembly, while straightforward, isn't exactly pop-in-pop-out. Every rib has to be connected with its stabilizer block, then bolted to the adjacent ribs, and finally the fabric has to be tensioned and secured with the provided straps. The manufacturer claims you can set it up in under an hour, and that is realistic provided you have at least 2 people. One person handling the fabric while the other tightens bolts makes a big difference. Solo users will find the process more time-consuming, which can be a pain if you're at a campsite and want the shelter up before sunset. The learning curve is low but not non-existent. You'll want to read the manual once before the first use to avoid mis-tightening a bolt, which can create a weak point in the structure. From a value perspective, the main cost drivers are the steel frame and the commercial-grade fabric. Compared with cheaper canvas shelters that use aluminum poles, this shelter will cost more upfront, but the durability you get, especially the rust-resistant coating, means you're likely to keep it for years without needing to replace the frame or patch the fabric. If your typical use case involves frequent exposure to rain, wind, or UV, the long-term savings from not having to buy a new shelter every few seasons becomes significant. On the other